You are listening to the Ivy Podcast. Learn from the thought leaders in areas of strategy, innovation, negotiation, and all things leadership. We interview the Ivy League, Fortune 100, and top startups. Now, here's your host, John Karsibayev.
Welcome to another episode of the Ivy Podcast. Today, we host Chief Executive Officer of Stack Overflow, Prashanth Chandrasekar. Prashanth is responsible for driving Stack Overflow's overall strategic direction and results. Previously, he served as a Senior Vice President and General Manager of Rackspace Cloud and Infrastructure Services. Prior to joining Rackspace, he was a Vice President at Barclays Investment Bank and a manager at Capgemini Consulting. Prashanth holds an MBA from Harvard Business School and Masters in Engineering Management from Cornell University and a Bachelor of Science in Computer Engineering from the University of Maine. Welcome to the Ivy Podcast. Prashanth, so you're 2 months into your job as the CEO of Stack Overflow. Has it turned out to be what you had initially expected and planned for? Curious, what have been the most interesting discoveries during that tenure?
Yeah, so it's been a very exciting 2 months so far, especially because I've gotten a chance to meet with a ton of people and people within the company and as well as externally. So within the company, I've met with every single employee, as we call it, stackers within our company. And also met with a whole range of community members, as well as customers who are customers of our paying products, and also just in terms of the ecosystem, just understanding even with our partners, how they view us and how do they actually work with us in the future. So it's just been a joy to really learn about, have a 360 view of how our company operates internally, externally, on multiple dimensions. So that's been, I would say, the bulk of my time in the first 30 days and really understanding our own value proposition, what do we do, how do we focus our time and effort for not only 2020 but beyond. So it's been fascinating. What's been interesting is, as I've had those conversations, it's been just really great to see so much enthusiasm, both externally as well as internally, from folks about wanting to increase the impact of our organization. We obviously have a massive impact with 50 million people that show up on our website on a monthly basis, but the economic impact that we create on a yearly basis is really significant. It's like in the billions of dollars, right? Because we accelerate people's learning and understanding and people's contributions, and so it's just been, I would say, heartwarming to learn that and experience it. But also get really excited about the tremendous potential that we have to build on the existing community that we have and the platform that we built with that sort of massive user base, plus also to add value to our target customer or in our community, effectively developers and technical workers through our revenue generating products. So there's so much to do there to help them accelerate their developer workflow and to make them more productive and to collaborate and share knowledge internally.
Great. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
A lot of developers use and very familiar with Stack Overflow, yet it seems that a lot of companies are not really aware of the products and services that you guys offer. The balance between the business and the community has always seemed to be at the center of Stack Overflow, Stack Exchange. Can you please share your thoughts on how will that balance be reached without compromising the value of open community, yet remain profitable?
Yeah, no, great question. I think it all comes down to the mission, like why we exist, right, and our purpose. So I think for us, it's been very clear that we want to, ultimately, the way we word it is we say we want to help write the script of the future by serving developers and technical workers. So it all starts and ends with that statement, because everything that we do should be in the spirit of accomplishing that mission. And recently I laid out our top 5 priorities, and much of it is centered around how do we make this a reality over the next several years, and obviously in 2020 what are the meaningful steps we're going to make. So the balance between the two are actually fairly tied, because the community is one way to help our end customer that I just described, but also as we have encountered and we have engaged with the community, we've discovered there are so many other ways in which we can actually help them. Because as an example, we have developers need to find jobs as they there's obviously a tremendous number of opportunities for folks, and people have an opportunity to grow in their careers. So we launched our talent product as a result of that, in the spirit of helping developers have flexibility around their careers. Developers want to understand what's happening in the ecosystem so that they are able to engage with developer-centric products that exist from companies around the world. So that's why we launched our engagement and advertising products to make sure they're aware of the products that exist with large companies. And then most recently, we launched a very, very promising set of products, the SaaS products, which are called Teams, which is all around helping developers and technical workers collaborate very rapidly internally within their organizations. In addition to getting knowledge externally through the community, they also wanted to have the ability to talk about things that were, or share information that were that was more private within the organization, in addition to leveraging the external community. So all of these we're constantly asking the question, again, that mission statement is what guides our product development cycles, what we actually build. Some of them will be revenue generating. The foundation is obviously the community that's obviously open and free for everybody to use, and it's obviously massive in terms of its impact. But on top of that, there are very specific things that our customers are asking us for, or community is asking us for, that we're building into these revenue generating products. And of course, that helps us build better tools in the community, and it's a virtuous cycle, because helping generate revenue helps the community indirectly, and so it's a very, I would say, symbiotic relationship.
Great overview of some of the services and tools that you guys are currently offering and also working on. On top of that, according to the latest McKinsey study and publication by Forbes, approximately 150 million professionals in the U.S. have left stable corporate jobs for independent consulting, and knowledge-intensive industries such as IT are amongst the fastest-growing segments of gig economy. How do you see this trend will affect the growth of the community-based platforms like Stack Overflow?
Yeah, no, great question. I think that we have a lot of pattern recognition around this topic because on a yearly basis we conduct our developer survey, and this past year in 2019, again we sent that survey to millions of our community members. We effectively got about 90,000 responses. So our data set is very meaningful and material and statistically relevant, right? So as part of that, some fascinating kind of findings for us is, as an example, over 80% of the people that responded were coding as a hobby and not as a profession necessarily. So it just tells you the number of people that are coming into the software development field because they all see the impact of technology and the impact of software on the world. And it's effectively the future in many ways, right? So that's a reflection of what's happening in the broader kind of ecosystem. And in addition, what we also found fascinating is the skill level of folks that are coming online, so to speak. Almost over half of the people that responded said that they had written a line of code before they were 16 years old, which is pretty fascinating to us, that you've got so many young people, which is amazing, right? You have young people from around the world that are coming on, learning through Stack Overflow and contributing their code into the ecosystem, whether through open source projects or in their first jobs or just accelerated development on their own. So all those, I think, give you a sense of the types of individuals and the folks that are coming, the new folks that are coming into the software development space. It also showcases, by the way, some of the most sought after roles and the roles that have got the most amount of demand out there. So for example, we noticed that DevOps and site reliability engineering roles are highly, highly in demand. They're probably at the top of the list based on our statistics. And this showcases this underlying trend of the cloud and how that's impacting the broader ecosystem, along with things like big data and machine learning and artificial intelligence. And so those underlying forces and roles like DevOps, again, and site reliability engineering is really showcasing how people are building applications, cloud native applications, or transforming their existing applications into cloud applications or cloud-based applications in a way that propels the innovation cycles of the organizations that they're part of. So it just showcases, I think, the vast amount of change that's effectively undergoing is going on within companies and also in the ecosystem today, and the number of people that you actually need to be able to meet all those needs.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely very interesting statistics, and we can definitely relate on some of the examples you gave on site reliability engineers, how hard they are to find. And we see a lot of trends where a lot of companies that struggle to find some of the candidates as such, they invest heavily into development and mentoring and the learning programs where they can bring on professionals who are now coding as a hobby almost, and then onboard them to the organization and provide those training tools and learning tools so they can, as a career progression, grow towards that. So there's a lot of investment into that, and that's definitely very promising for the overall economy. So Stack Overflow is a community of tech enthusiasts, and there seems to be a good deal of information on the internet. And also, we've talked to a lot of our own consultants who heavy users of the platform around the overall Stack Overflow's communication with some of the Stack Exchange, let's say, moderators. And of course, having a community as large as this, there's always that balance that you have to find. How much you can expose into the decision making, how much is stays internal. One of the latest products that we looked at, the Loop, aims to incorporate that community feedback into companies' decisions, especially in the new year coming 2020. Is that part of your strategy to incorporate the community voice into some of the corporate decision making?
100%. I think that if I talk about the two most important things that we need to do as an organization, like the underlying forces, one is truly taking a customer and community orientation at the heart of everything. So literally in every conversation that we have, always assume that there's a community member in the room and in an empty chair, right? As we have a meeting, as an example, is one way to visualize it. And the second very, very big thing is to have very, very engaged stackers, to make sure they're highly engaged in what we're doing and are very clear about what we're trying to accomplish. So both those things I have emphasized in my first 60 days as probably being the most being the most important underlying forces for us to be able to do everything that we do. Now, as part of that, my assessment is that the scale at which we operate is massive, if you think about it, right? So again, 50 million people coming to our website on a monthly basis, 25 million questions and answers in Stack Overflow, right? Just Stack Overflow, not even Stack Exchange. And then you have the current ways in which we actually gather feedback. They were started out. We used mechanisms like Meta when we started out, and they've been extremely effective for us to be able to engage with a group of highly engaged power users and people that really care. And we have a tremendous amount of respect for what they share, because they represent in many ways the thought process of how to make the community better at large. On top of that, what we wanted to make sure is that we also took a much more holistic approach and not in a way to actually gather more structured feedback, because it's hard to actually get, for example, if you think about product development cycles, and when you actually talk to customers and you say, this is what we need to go build, it's typically, there's a very, very defined process. I come from the world where we take that feedback very, very with a data-driven approach. You actually do something to prioritize what you actually work on, and then you go and deploy resources against those priorities, and then you go execute on those. Like, that's generally how you do things, right? In the same spirit, we want to understand, in order for us to build the tools that are very relevant for this community, whether that's moderator tools or other tools that the community will find useful. For example, like our GitHub integration that we just recently did, came from the community as a request. But it was mentioned in a very specific way that was that we were lucky to catch it as part of the feedback loop. But we want to be even more deliberate about how we catch feedback from the community, and which is why we launched this initiative in the past 30 days around the Loop, which is really a redefinition of how we actually listen to the community and how we take that feedback and how do we build that into our product development cycles, and how do we be very transparent with what we're hearing and what we're doing about it, and through actions, through actual delivery of product roadmap items, right? And to also have true multiple voices of customers, so to speak, or voices of the community as part of that, to make sure that we are holistic about how we capture that structured feedback. So the Loop is in many ways to make sure we take a data-driven approach that's leveraging this massive community and all their voices to then build what is relevant for that community in a very structured fashion. So that's the approach. We're highly committed, because we would not be the company we are today if it were not for the community. Right. And so I think it's our responsibility to actually raise our game, to listen to the community even more meaningfully and in a more structured fashion, so we can actually do something about it, versus just being reactive about things that are happening.
Right. Great, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
On just to carry on that same thing, we interview people for a living. That's our profession: executive search or IT staffing, whether that's management consulting and so forth. I love the idea of adjusting the reputation scoring based on not only providing a useful answer, but also asking a very thoughtful question. To the extent that you can share based on internal strategies, can you talk about some of the innovative features or new products that you guys are currently have in the works that planned for next year?
Yeah, so I can talk about that broadly, right? I think that across our community as well as our revenue generating products, there's so much to talk about. We're just literally in the process of finalizing our 2020 product roadmap across our private teams product, our community capability, obviously, our talent product, and our engagement and advertising product. So literally, we are in the process of doing that, so it's well timed. Overall, we, as part of the community engagement specifically, we want to define the roadmap based on what we just described around the loop. So we want to actually get very structured feedback on what we want to build in the next couple of years, and we go and effectively gather that feedback and go build it. We have a view on what we need to build over the next 6 months at a minimum for the community. So there's a lot that's going on there to make sure that we are more inclusive and more welcoming of all kinds of new developers, right, of various skill levels. There's a certain level of logic that is allowed our community actually to build to the level that it is today. The very definitive answer that you get when you ask a question, and asking a good question, there's power in that, because you're able to get the right answer very quickly, and through the mechanism of upvoting and downvoting, there is an element there. But there's also opportunity for us to be constructive for folks that are coming to the community, for the first time, and as an example, to be more welcoming for them to ask questions that may be early questions in their development, but that's okay. So how do we do that? How do we provide much of our thought process on product development for the community is how do we make it more welcoming for those folks to get constructive feedback? So can we provide, as an example, can we provide reasons for when somebody actually downvotes a question or downvotes an answer, right? Can we actually provide that to the person that's on the receiving end of that, so they actually understand why, versus just going through the emotion of actually being downvoted or upvoted, right? That's a negative and a positive emotion. Both those things I think are good. They're different, obviously, but how do we give them more guidance along the way? So that's an example of how do we want to make sure that we are more welcoming towards new folks, both on the question side as well as answer side, specifically in the community. Now, on the revenue generating products, there's a lot that we are also doing there, including, for example, for our Teams product. Let me just take that as an example. We are working with a ton of customers to make sure that we are very much part of the developer workflow when they are trying to collaborate and share knowledge internally. So, most customers or most companies or developers, what they use in their daily jobs is they use Stack Overflow or via Google. They'll go type in a question, they get an answer. That's part of that workflow. They're probably chatting on something like Slack or Microsoft Teams. They're probably collaborating their code or collaborating with other people with their code through something like GitHub, right? And they're probably using something like Jira as an example from Atlassian. So with those four things, Stack Overflow, GitHub, Slack, and Jira, that is, in our world, an example of a developer workflow of what they actually spend time on, what tools they use, and how do we augment that experience based on what we actually have, right, access to. So one idea is we want to make sure that we are even more integrated with technologies across that spectrum. So, for example, we've already integrated with Okta. From an identity management perspective, we integrated with Slack earlier this year. We integrated with Microsoft Teams earlier this year. And then we are going to integrate with Jira in January. And we're going to be integrating with GitHub Enterprise in February of 2020. We just integrated GitHub in our public community. So any user of GitHub can just easily integrate or can easily log into a Stack Overflow account through just a common login through GitHub as an example. So that's been launched. But the point is, how do we make it even more integrated with everything that developers are using so that they don't break out of their developer workflow? How do they just stay consistent with their existing workflow is one of the areas of focus for us in our Teams product. And the other thing that we've been talking to customers is how do we help them build even more specific communities within our own community, right? So there's a very large number of folks like developer advocates within companies that go and spend a ton of time answering questions on Stack Overflow on products that are very close to them. So it could be, for example, BigQuery at Google, right? If somebody has a question on BigQuery, there's a question somewhere in the community, and there are people at Google Cloud answering those questions very actively. That's just one example. But so how do we make it even more faster in terms of the response rate, and how do we not only leverage the community's enthusiasm to answer those questions, but also how do we get them some help from companies to actually also provide official documentation or other things that maybe even that the companies are closer to as a part of that answer in a more structured fashion. So those are things that we are debating and thinking through as part of our product development cycles.
Great. Definitely, thank you for sharing that as part of the roadmap strategy for next year. It definitely looks very exciting. We've talked a little bit about some of the in-demand skill sets, some of the most challenging roles out there, and trace in the industry in general. I'm curious, as part of the Stack Overflow specifically, what are some of the most challenging and in-demand skills that you guys are looking for right now to add to your teams? And what are some of the strategies you guys have in play, obviously probably using your internal tools to find those resources for your own team?
Yeah, no, great question. I think much like I would say the industry experiences, the demand for roles like DevOps and site reliability engineers, security professionals, very much highly in demand, right? And I think those are very specialized skills, people that have been exposed to things like cloud transformation, even given my own experience at Rackspace. And some of the reasons why we existed is because that there's a sort of a shortage of skills in those sort of arenas. So I would say skills like that, I think, are the ones that I think we are actively looking to, as we scale our own products and we scale, to bring on more members in our community and customers. It's important to have that ability to, scale in a utility fashion. So the ability to actually to find people that have done that a few times very successfully, that's I would say the skill set that is probably the most I would say in demand, and probably tough to find, and also to they're also expensive roles to fill, right, on average. So those are probably the ones that I would highlight. And the reason probably for that is because we're so early in the transformation for things like the cloud. Because we're literally, probably 20% of IT workloads are now in the cloud. So there's a long way to go. So it's not like there's a tremendous number. There are a lot of people that are becoming certified, and of course on AWS and Microsoft Azure and Google, etc. But the number of people that have actually completed a whole-scale transformation into the cloud, there's I would say not enough people that have done that successfully, or done it multiple times, where they've gone through the pains of actually making some mistakes and recovering from them and learning from them and so on.
Right.
So,
absolutely, I can definitely relate to those. Are you personally involved in, or at least get involved in a lot of interviews internally?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm a very active, hands-on interviewer, because I think that, especially a company in its earlier days, even though we're a 10-year-old company and we're very, I would say, meaningful in terms of our size, it's important for us to, I would say all my leaders, I encourage them to be very close to this process, because it defines the culture of the organization. It defines, as you're transforming, how you want to operate in the next few years. It's important to, evolve as you bring on every new hire. Better be better than, the last hire that we brought on, right? And better be smarter than all of us around the room on a very specific topic. So we raise the game every day when we bring on every hire. So it's, I think, critical for us to spend time as a leadership team and be active on that, and absolutely, I do that for sure.
Great.
Yeah.
Do you tend to get creative with your interviews, or are they pretty standard? Any, to the extent, of course, that you can share? Do you ask any, as far as questions, do you get creative in terms of types of questions, and what exactly you look for in terms of some of these responses, or aside from the specific domain skill set
Yeah.
in terms of traits or?
Yeah, I would say I think beyond the obvious, is the person very strong from a competency perspective, and do they have the raw intellectual horsepower to kind of do the work? Are they a cultural fit relative to the core values of our organization, to make sure they're they embody those things, so there's no philosophical differences when they come into the organization. Those are, I think, most companies probably think of those items. I think one thing that's very important for me particularly is somebody who actually has a growth mindset, who actually is willing to take feedback and want to be better, like every day, literally, right? Better than the previous day. And who is not necessarily set in their ways about just because they operate a certain way in a different environment that they're not going to flex based on what the requirements are within this organization. Because most things are changing. Most things in the world are changing. Things are moving very fast. So if you don't adopt that, at least my belief is that it's hard to actually be constructively productive, or to move things forward in a constructive fashion. So that's one thing that I do test for personally, is do the individuals that we bring on, are they open to change? And there are a few different ways to do that. Of course, everybody's going to say they're open to change, but there are ways in which I think they within conversations we can actually test for that, to make sure that they are prepared for a series of evolutions as we evolve as a company. They are willing to evolve with us, and they're going to be part of the change, and effectively be accelerants as part of that. So that's probably the one thing I would point out.
Great, definitely. Thank you for sharing that. So for a lot of our listeners, if you guys are interviewing with Prashanth, there you go, some intel for you. So in some of the closing remarks, I usually like to ask, what are you currently reading, and what is one book that you always recommend to others?
Yeah, both good questions. Maybe I'll answer the second one first. The second one is related to what I just mentioned, which is Carol Dweck wrote this book around a growth mindset. So I think Mindset is the name of the book, and I would highly recommend that to anybody. It was really, when I read it several years ago, it was a game changer for me when I read it, and it allows you to think very differently about your own point of view and how you should operate as an individual who's trying to make a difference. So that's one I would recommend to everybody. The book that I'm reading currently is actually a book that my dad gave me recently, and coincidentally was somebody that we actually interviewed recently at Stack Overflow as well. So the name of the book is Coders, and the Coders book is really from a phenomenal author that we just had on, I think about 3-4 weeks ago, on Stack Overflow's podcast, right? I need to repeat that. I forgot his name. Sorry, I was looking for it on that. Clive Thompson, yes.
The podcast has aired yet.
It hasn't aired.
You did write a blog post with him, so I don't know if it's aired yet or when it.
Okay. Can we redo that second part?
Sure. We can. And also for the listeners, we'll make the links and the titles of these books available in the episode notes. Okay. So that should not be an issue.
Okay. Should I start from the second part, or the book that I'm currently reading? Should I start from there? Okay.
Yeah. If you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah. So a book that I'm currently reading is Coders by Clive Thompson. And I think it's just I've just begun the book, and it was a book that my dad gave me as I just started this role, and then coincidentally we also had a conversation with Clive Thompson at Stack Overflow a few weeks ago. So it's, by the way, published on our blog, which you can go read. So yes, so those are the books.
Great.
Yeah.
That's great. Prashanth, thank you so much. I know you're very busy. What I like to do as part of our podcast is also check in with a lot of the guests on the Ivy podcast in a couple of years, and to see how much has changed, how much growth has occurred in between. So I definitely would welcome that opportunity. And thank you so much for finding time. I know how busy you are.
Sounds good. My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Great. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Ivy Podcast. Be sure to subscribe to our RSS feed on ivypodcast.com and all major podcasting platforms like Spotify and iTunes. As always, if you enjoyed this podcast, please give us a rating on iTunes.